DCI Tom Barnaby and DS Gavin Troy were trudging through the fields when they saw to their surprise a rake. Barnaby commanded Troy to look up, and as soon as they did, they saw the head of a rake attached by the neck to a pair of iron legs that were lying on the ground. Barnaby did not hesitate as he thrust Troy forward into the garden to see what they could find. When Barnaby questioned Jamie, "Jamie, is that you?" he did not respond, so Barnaby demanded he answer him, and when he did, it was obvious to the detective that Jamie was not Jamie at all. Matthew Bartlett had killed Jamie with a rake handle and put the rake into the garden shed. When he found his cousin Jamie deceased in a garden shed, Matthew had taken his body to another garden shed and spread it over a lawn, and there he had doused it with gasoline before wrapping it in a rug and burning it. At some point later, the rug had caught fire and fallen onto Jamie's body. While Matthew had burned Jamie alive, the detective had been desperately searching for any trace of the crime. He knew that Matthew would likely be making his way back to his home in the Midsummer community. While this was happening, Troy was enjoying the sights of Midsummer as he searched for clues to the murder. He had located the garden shed and was raking up the blood when Troy found a ring with a lone diamond. It was later reported by his father, John, that Troy was deeply moved by the sight of the blood and had seen visions of people being hurt and dying. While Troy continued to search for clues, he stumbled upon Jamie's bloody jacket. Troy looked into the garden shed, but he could not find anything because the room was filthy. Troy also noticed a broken garden gate that he assumed had been used to carry the body from the shed to the shed on the garden lawn. When Troy entered the garden, he could see the garden gate opening onto a garden, where he saw Jamie's body in the snow. It was clear to Troy that Jamie was not Jamie, and the killer was now out of sight. "Sir?" Inspector Pippin's voice called out from the doorway of the garden shed. "Sir? Is that you, sir?" "Sir?" Matthew stood up, but before he could answer, Pippin opened the door to reveal Jamie's bloody corpse. With tears in his eyes, Matthew looked at Pippin and screamed, No, 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 sir, no! You're a killer, a murderer! You're a murderer! You're a—" But he was interrupted by the sensation of the secateurs being plunged pointy end first into the base of his neck. Pippin died on the spot from his injuries. "No!" Matthew shouted in horror and shock, but Jamie had appeared to his side and stabbed Matthew in the gut, causing him to scream in pain. Jamie then looked over his shoulder and saw Matthew and John Bartlett running towards them. He pointed the garden rake at Matthew and ordered John to stand and watch. He knew he would not make it to the Midsummer police station, so he intended to catch the killer himself. It was with that intent that he walked into the garden shed and stabbed John Bartlett in the throat. As John Bartlett struggled with the chair he found himself standing on, Jamie took out the garden shears and slit his own throat. Just when the detectives were about to follow Jamie into the shed, a stinging sensation brought him back to his senses. "Jamie!" Matthew screamed out, not caring if the killer could hear him. "Jamie! I want you to let me go!" Jamie had dropped the garden rake and threw himself into the flower bed. When Jamie heard Matthew's voice, he had run out of the garden shed, down the garden steps, and into the garden, with the garden shears in hand. He bled out on the path by the fountain. The fountain ran dry with Jamie's blood, but the rain caused the garden shed to flood. Chapter 2. Through the Door. Willing to be stranded. Tom Barnaby was oblivious to everything and was enjoying the grass that he had laid over the garden. He wondered why nobody else seemed to like it. He had laid some grass to cover the garden shed and had cleared a space to walk and take his pooch, Moses. Tom had always enjoyed walking Moses and taking him for a stroll, because Moses' ears were better than most people's. Moses could hear people, and as long as Tom held the lead tightly in his hand, Moses would always come to him. Moses heard the sound of distant screaming, and he knew that someone was being murdered. Tom was worried that Moses was beginning to hear things too much, and he was afraid that one day the dog might take off. He wished he could go to the vet and talk to the vet about this, but Moses would never let him go. Tom often heard him laughing and enjoying himself. Tom wished he had his own ears instead of Moses's. He could hear footsteps behind him and turned to look. He was amazed to see a stranger staring at him through the garden gates. The stranger took a few steps towards Tom and waved at him. When Tom looked down at the garden, he could see Jamie Bartlett sitting in a garden chair with his back to Tom. Jamie waved his arm around, and Tom wondered if he was waving at him. Jamie walked back and forth and spoke over and over again. "I want to go through the garden gate." He had no idea what he meant, and he was beginning to get angry. "I want to go through the garden gate, and I want to be allowed to go through the garden gate." "Sir?" Troy called out from the garden gate. The barking of Moses stopped, and Tom looked towards his dog and saw him lying on the garden lawn. He looked back up to the garden, and Jamie was lying on his back in the garden shed. Tom looked back at Jamie and shouted, "Sir? Sir, don't move! Sir!" While Tom was thinking about that, his arm suddenly went numb. He could not feel his arm at all. Tom panicked and tried to take it off, but he couldn't. He felt nothing, and he had no idea how he had ended up on the garden path with only his arm. The secateurs lay next to the gate. "I want to go through the garden gate," Jamie whispered out loud. "Sir?" Troy called from the garden gate. Tom Barnaby had lost his arm. Chapter 3. Losing My Mind. Tom had returned from hospital, and he was sitting in his recliner watching The Wheel of Fortune on TV. It was a celebrity special starring the actor Steve Carmichael. He had recently been in a film that had been called The Midsummer Murders. He had been shot at while trying to catch a burglary. He had come back into the garden with his hand in a sling and a walking stick. Tom sat up and leaned his body against the chair and felt his leg start to shake. He leaned forward and tried to get his breathing back to normal. He saw his arm and thought he had lost his mind. He started to panic and got back up and was struggling to sit on the couch, but his legs were shaking too. "I want to go through the garden gate," came a voice from the TV. Tom's arm was still numb and he could not feel his leg. "Sir? Sir?" Troy called out from the garden gate. "Sir?" Troy called out. "Sir?" Tom heard someone whisper out loud. "Sir?" "I want to go through the garden gate," Jamie whispered out loud again. Tom panicked and put both of his hands on the arm of the chair. It was burning hot and he tried to get his arm off. "Sir? Sir?" Troy called out. Tom tried to get to his feet and was in a lot of pain as his leg moved from under him. He could feel the skin on his back and his arms sticking to his chest. He fell to the floor in the kitchen where he lay on the floor. Tom sat up and looked around the garden. He was lying on the garden grass with his foot on the bench and the secateurs laying next to the gate. "Sir?" Troy called out. "Sir?" "Sir?" Tom heard someone whisper. "I want to go through the garden gate," Jamie said over and over again. Tom could not see Jamie in the garden anymore. His eyes were seeing, and the voice that was whispering out loud, the voice that was repeating the words over and over. Tom had lost his mind. Tom put his right leg on the floor and pushed himself back up on his left arm. He looked towards the garden gate and saw that it had been moved and the gate was open. "I want to go through the garden gate," Jamie said out loud over and over again. "I want to go through the garden gate," said Jamie out loud again. "I want to go through the garden gate," said Jamie out loud again. Tom was shocked to see his yard, and everything around him was green and beautiful and looked like his garden that he had spent months gardening in the summer. Tom did not feel the grass under his feet when he tried to stand. His legs hurt so badly. "I want to go through the garden gate." "I want to go through the garden gate," repeated Jamie, out loud, out loud, out loud, out loud. "I want to go through the garden gate." "I want to go through the garden gate," repeated Jamie, out loud, out loud, out loud, out loud. Chapter 4. The Garden Gate. The garden gate was still closed, but Jamie saw the flowers and saw the blue sky and realised that he was on the other side of the fence that he had been in with Tom and Troy. The garden gate looked so much bigger and there was so much more to see and hear. He was too scared to go back in because he did not want Troy to see him. Jamie stopped screaming and did not move for a long time. In fact, he didn't move at all. He was seeing things that were different to his world. He could see the pink fluffy clouds above him. They looked just like they would rain, but that was impossible. It wasn't possible to have a rainstorm outside. Just the opposite. It was always sunny outside. His mind did not want to accept that he was stuck out on the other side of the fence. He knew he had to open the gate and run into the garden, even if it was dark and all the lights had gone out in his world. "I want to go through the garden gate," Jamie said out loud, out loud, out loud. Jamie stared at the garden gate for a long time and thought it was a fluffy pink ball. He could not see it. The only reason he could see it was because the flowers in the garden had grown bigger. Jamie wished he was Tom, or even Troy, someone with brown hair and big, pink, fluffy sunglasses. Someone familiar. There were people down the street that reminded him of his dad. "Let's see where all the secrets are hidden in the bushes and neat flower gardens," Troy whispered to himself, and as he lowered himself down on the big, fluffy cotton cover along the garden fence, they went towards the house. Tom liked the foliage down the path. They smelled like warm coffee.